My name is Marius Bartmann, and I'm a research associate at the German Reference Center for Ethics in the Life Sciences, focusing on the ethics of climate change. So I am very happy to be your moderator for this morning session. And if the first day of the conference is any indication, we can all look forward to another day with great talks and interesting discussions. We are all joined here to build a stronger and bigger community to raise awareness and make more visible the topic of sustainability of AI and the sustainability for AI. So I'm very excited about the first day. I'm looking forward to a great second day, and I'm very excited about our first speaker today. But before handing over the floor, I want to make a quick announcement. This concerns a call for papers associated with this conference. There is a collaboration between the Institute for Science and Ethics and the international journal Sustainability. Researchers are invited to submit a paper for a special issue on the following topic: towards the sustainability of AI, multidisciplinary approaches to investigate the hidden costs of AI. So deadline is September 1st. You are all welcome to contribute and contribute to our community building efforts. So in general, I simply want to remind everyone, all the speakers, just about the rules. We have the classic 20-10 rule, so 20 minutes to speak and 10 minutes for Q&A sections. I will signal you after about 18 minutes. So that you know you have 2 minutes left before the Q&A. But for our very first talk, we have a slightly different setup. Here we have like 45 minutes, and our first speaker will roughly speak about like 30 minutes, and then we have enough time for a Q&A. So now I'm very happy that she's here today. Louise Hickman will be our first speaker, and so I just want to make brief introductions and let those speakers speak for themselves. If you want to say a little bit more about yourself, feel free to do so. Just say something about your position, what you do, and then you can proceed to your presentation. So without further ado, I'm very excited that you're here again. So now I'm handing over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here on this sunny morning in London. I am going to introduce myself, but I'm going to use my slides to introduce myself to give a little bit of context of what I'm going to talk about today. I just want to throw it out there. I would really love it if you have questions along the way, just throw them in chat, or if you have general comments in the chat. I really like the feedback loop that the chat can generate, so please feel welcome. So today I'm going to be drawing on a lot of strands of work within the Just AI project and my colleagues, and kind of what we've been doing and how it kind of goes into each of our work. So the title today is Deep Sustainabilities, Access, Repair, and Intergenerational Justice. So I'm going to use this internet clicker. Wow, it's the first time I've used it. Thank you. It's great. So I come from a critical disability studies background. I did my PhD in UC San Diego, in which I was a postdoc with Lilia Rani's Feminist Labour Lab. This is a lab that does a lot of research around technology and smart cities and the future of work. And by being engaged with this lab work, I've come to think about accessibility and how disabled people come to access technology. So in a kind of more critical way, rather than thinking about disability as a kind of medical condition, I've been thinking about the social category of disability. So here I have a kind of a range of books up here, which really, I think, signals critical access studies. So these are scholars, Sarah Hendren, Amy Hamrai, Beth Williamson, which they really go into the history of how disabled people come to shape the design that practices that we are aware of today. You know, one example of these design practices is one of my favorite stories is thinking about how disability activists in Berkeley, the city of Berkeley in California, and not necessarily associated with the university, but during that time, there were still curbs, pavements, raised pavements, and one night they went out with sledgehammers and they started smashing the kind of sidewalk to make drop curbs, which everyone uses today. If you have a skateboard or you push your baby. And so now these have become a part of our everyday culture, but actually the origins of those designs were not a kind of high up infrastructural civic design, but actually these were designed by disabled people taking action. And so with that in mind, I'm really trying to, in like the last part of this talk today, is I'm really interested in thinking about how we can think about ethics in a way that mediates the kind of high-level abstraction of data, but also connect that back down onto the ground too. So as I walk through the kind of projects, the Just AI project, which I am affiliated with, which is co-hosted between the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Ada Lovelace Institute. So we are a kind of small team that works within Ada to really think about ethics. And so in preparation for today's discussion on sustainability, climate, environment, I just spent the last day with my colleague Emery and generating some visual data viz on kind of citations on issues connected to the general theme of the conference. And what I hope to do is by walking through these various steps of these visualizations, I'm hoping that we can really get a sense of what the project has been trying to do in this, which it's interesting, and I think this will come out, the kind of dilemmas that we have been dealing with in the last few kind of months. And I should mention that Alison Powell is the director of the Just AI team, and Alison had just released a book on the optimization. So this is actually something that I'm going to weave in again at the last section of this talk as I move through the different variations of maps. So if I move on, so one aspect of the Just AI network is we really was thinking about how do we network with care, right? So by networking with care, we've really taken interventions in ways that really foreground these like, how do we remake networks, right? So how do we make interventions in ways that are reflective? And then in doing that, we've also been thinking about how do we make space. Using my lab work experience from UC San Diego, we've been generating these lab spaces where they've been functioning as a kind of hub, a hub of like scholars, practitioners that come together to really focus on particular subjects. And so doing that work is also about building capacity. So like, how do you build capacity in ways that are sustainable? And the theme of this conference today is like, how do we bring these networks together and we keep carrying this work forward? So if I switch to this remaking networks, this is a really challenging project in many ways. And what we've been doing over the course of the last few months is really thinking about how do we do metric analysis. And so here you have a sense of how we've been looking at data in the sense of who've been doing research on ethics, on big data, and really getting a sense of what we've been using keywords analysis amongst others as a way to really think about how we can play with networks as well. So we've taken the time period between 2010 to 21. Emery Bard, which I put up here, has spent a lot of time cleaning this data. And I cannot emphasize how hard it is to kind of bring in all these database systems with different requirements in a way that produces an effective conversation in thinking about how we can remodel these networks. Okay, so here we just have the kind of big terms that we've been using: AI, machine learning, and so forth. And so when we did this, we were able to use this data in a way that we could generate these images, right? And so these images here, I don't want to spend that long looking at these images, because it's not so much what these represent, but it gives an indication of what we're trying to do in this project, right? So this is a kind of algorithm that's looking at the core terms that's generated around titles and abstracts of the papers that are cited. So when we looked at sustainability climate, there were 79 papers amongst the vast database system that we built. And so we could use these papers to generate what these papers might look like. So we have knowledge, we have growth, and decision, choice, and rights. And then we can take apart, and we can kind of take apart this one, and we can look at the sustainable development goals, and we can now see a different direction. We can now see that there is a connection to harm, country outcome bias, and then we have humanity that's kind of down at the bottom there. But again, this is all to do, it's kind of like a storytelling. And I'll come back round to that in a minute. And I just want to keep moving through these images. Okay, and now we have, this one's slightly different. This is a cluster, hang on. This is co-occurring authors keywords, okay? Again, we're seeing a different collection of kind of map network visualization. We have ethics taking the central position. We have a clustering of tech and government and the future of robotics. And then if we can work through these imagery, we also can find that responsibility is down by the kind of lower right there with purple, highlighted in purple. But we also can see that there's these other emerging themes, right? In which sustainability is beginning to emerge in two areas, right? So if I just go to this slide, oh no, this is the one where you can see responsibility down on the lower right there in the purple, which is connecting sustainability. Again, we have an image here that is very much connecting sustainability to autonomous vehicles. So again, this is really about, I think it's really important to say that we shouldn't treat these maps as a diagnostic tool, but we should treat these as a way to think about how we can use these maps in ways, or these networks, in ways that we can invite multiple stakeholders into the conversation. So like how we can configure these conversations in ways that we can map out these interventions, right? So I'm going to take you to this image, which actually we have spent a little bit more time with compared to the one that I've just shown you on sustainability and climate. But here we have justice, right? So this is a really interesting clustering, actually, because I think in the orange we have the cluster, I think it to the left, is this is a group of citations organized by data justice, and then on the right we have the bigger cluster, which is a citation organized around justice. Okay, so they're very different fields that are emerging in the way that they're using citations and the way that they're engaging with literature. But what's really interesting in this map, which I think is perhaps a really good example of how the network visualization can help us to kind of shape these different engagements. You might see that there is a kind of connecting thread in the middle where there's a few authors, and I will tell you that those authors are Joe Bates and Taylor Lynette. And what's interesting is like, well, why those authors are situated in between those spaces, and what are they doing differently? And so in the near future, we hope to invite those authors into the lab space to really start to think about, or how do their work differ in ways that they situated in between these groups of citations. And I think this is actually a way of indicating the kind of work that we're trying to do. It's like really trying to model these different types of engagements. So this brings me to the next part, is thinking about, is there an ethical prototype for networking? And this actually is really exciting because next Monday, we have the launch of our survey tool, which I had said at the beginning of today when we were checking in, that we are in the middle of organizing a series of events within Just AI. And on Monday, we will be launching a survey tool, which I can put in the chat, the link tree for all the events. But what's happening here is, so now we have the kind of the background of the kind of work that we've been doing in the last year or so. is really thinking about the network visualization. But now we're coming to the next stage where we're really starting to think about how do we allow researchers to engage with the network. And so we have been prototyping with ideas of how to do that. And so this is an early prototype of how you might enter your information as a research working on ethics. And by answering a series of questions, we hope this will allow you as users to really think about what kind of work you do, but it's actually a reflective tool. So rather than thinking about you as a kind of individual, it's very much thinking about how your work connects to others, right? So maybe this is an opportunity for you to call on your junior scholars, for example, or this is an opportunity to identify the work that never gets funded, right? So this is a way of really kind of like building out what you look like in the field. So this is a Mycella network, so we kind of, when you choose an answer, it fills in. And I think this is emphasized in the next one, where you really can see the different types of engagement that you might take and how that might intervene in the kind of field of data and AI ethics. And one of the ongoing kind of dilemmas of this project is really thinking about how do we surface missing gaps of research, right? And so, and I think this is where my background comes in, is thinking about critical disability studies, is really thinking about how do we tell that story, how do we make sense that there is an absence of disability in the database in the way that I approach it. And so this brings me to the kind of, this is the flyer for our talk for the launch of the tool on Monday. I hope you can join us, because the more we can populate this, the more interesting the map becomes. So go to the next slide. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I want to now start kind of shifting gears a little bit and thinking about how these maps how do we approach these maps? And so by doing this, I'm going to kind of touch on a few keywords that access, fiction, commons, and these actually is bringing together my work with Alison's work and the project work. So I'm really calling on like a citational kind of weird collective here to really think about some of these key terms and how we can think about this in the field of AI ethics. And so in doing this, we got this. Right. So this slide is a slide from Alison's recent work, which was published recently. And I brought this image in because this is a different version of networking, right? So this is very much, this is Berlin and Athens. These two images, we have Wi-Fi kind of networking in play. But what I bring this image today or these two maps in a way to think about how Alison and I perhaps think about access differently, right? And yet there are connecting threads. So for Alison, the idea of the commons with, in these kind of frames here, is a way of reframing smart citizenship. And through these observations, how the commons, right, is constituted through differences, disagreement, and friction. and surrounding the data. So we're very much moving away from the idea that, the deterministic idea that we, climate crisis as being a kind of scientific fact, but actually now we're moving to the ground and really thinking about how this manifests on the ground. So thinking about data friction, which goes back to kind of Joe Bates' work and the other map, is thinking about how we bring together, how do we create fidelity in these networks, and how do we think about the plural aspects of different types of lives. And so what I hope, if I can, let me go to the next slide here. Now this is really now starting to think about access and disability. And these two images here are interesting in two ways. We're very much thinking about collective access, which connects back to the kind of, collective peer-to-peer building of a kind of anarchist network in Berlin, where they use the kind of ground knowledge to build these networks. If we go over here to the disability-led design, I want to point to the image on the right, where we can see there is a kind of central drawing place over the international wheelchair symbol, which was designed in 1968, and the first iteration didn't have a head, which is a kind of insight into the kind of history there. I would like to just show that the stencil being placed over the symbol is actually a kind of iteration of practice. And what I mean by that is these are activists who are kind of reclaiming what disability means. And so here we can see the wheelchair in a kind of forward facing position where they are active, they're engaged with their wheelchair in a way that is mobilized and going forward, which is very different from the static image that we see behind. And this is interesting because we see the tension between the policies of the international wheelchair symbol designed by the UN, and then activists reclaiming what this might mean. On the right, on the left, I think it's your left, is we have a kind of map of collective access building project where students are invited to contribute knowledge to on-the-ground accessibility. Again, this reflects back to Alison's kind of work. But there's something else going on here, which I think is really relevant to the conversation that I hope we can have in the Q&A, is really thinking about how big tech and how big techs are approaching these kind of questions around on the ground kind of production of knowledge. So how do we take that, these infrastructures? If I had more time today, I think I would have loved to show you this ethnographic film that I made a few years ago, which is, I'm not sure if you can see, but it is a kind of biodiesel bus. It was on campus. And what's interesting about this ethnographic film is that it's about 6 minutes long, and you see the bus arriving, you see these kind of marks of like pollution on the ground, of oil, dripping. But then there's this, there is this lull in the middle of the film where nothing happens, but all you hear is the sound of the bus, and it's a kind of really heavy, exhaust high kind of sound of a bus that's really not very healthy. And that 2 minutes, nothing happens, And it's like, in that kind of showing that film, it causes a lot of anxiety in the sense that this film actually doesn't have a conclusion. This is actually, which I should explain, that what happened in the film, that I am a wheelchair user trying to board this bus, and the ramp doesn't work, and it fails to come out and unveil, and in the process, the bus drives away. But this is, again, pointing to the tension between infrastructure. So if we're thinking about infrastructure as a kind of ADA compliance, as they might think about it in the States, and then you think about the kind of greenwashing of ADA, if you like, but you have these different iterations of infrastructures manifesting here. That the green kind of rhetoric doesn't quite align with accessibility. In the final moment of the film, you see these moments where people run for the bus, so they make it onto the bus. So there's a privileging of certain kind of bodies on these green buses. And then the image on the right, you can see a kind of jogger, and actually in the background, you see a hospital. So very much this kind of real insight into these different infrastructures. So I'm really conscious of time, so I am going to.
You do have some time left. You can elaborate if you want to.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so so let me go to the next slide, and I'm just going to find my notes here. Because I've been talking off. So returning back to the ideas of the commons, is in many ways these are a kind of, I'm starting to show you the tension between the kind of maps that I showed you earlier and the reconfigurations of maps that featured in Alison's work. Right, but what's really an interesting aspect of doing this work is thinking about how to convene around these frictions, right? And so how do we build totality around these? So if I come back to this slide, we think about fiction through totality. So the question here is, for Alison's work, it's not about optimization. It's not about pulling in the particular resources to optimize the city as we might think about it in smart cities, but it's a question of thinking about how do we think about the coexistence of these infrastructures, right? So we have the kind of datafication, which if we're thinking about the mapping of access project by Amy Hemright, is actually those mapping projects, many exist, but they rely on individuals with access to particular sets of knowledges, so the inconsistencies of the project in many ways are kind of localized. They can't be built up in a way that they are kind of universal projects. So in that way, that is how we can think about the mapping projects in ways that how can we bring together the kind of extraction of thinking about the kind of citational work that we've been doing, which I showed you at the beginning, is to really start to connect that to the ground. And like, how do we think about these conversations? So here I have this is Hannah, who is Alison's daughter, and I really like this image, and it's really thinking about the present moment of COVID. Now thinking about here in London, there has been a real shift to actually close down streets in London to have them only as pedestrian only. And so this is actually an image of her daughter moving around in the world in ways that are kind of decentralized ways that we can think about optimizing the city, right? So here we have the kind of flourishing of communities, the flourishing that the kind of communities that are come out during the pandemic in ways during the pandemic in the way that the infrastructure changed. So the street closed down. It meant that children could go outside, but also this presents other problems. So, you know, for people with disabilities, it meant that they couldn't go directly to their houses and so forth. So again, this is like I think it's the tension, is the ongoing tension of will this scale? You know, recently, as part of the Just AI project, we've invited Sarah Hendren, who recently wrote a book on what a body can do. And in this book, again, she recalls on the histories of disability design in ways that really question the universalization of access. And this kind of maps onto Alison's discussion, and I probably haven't done it justice today, but thinking about optimization and universal design in many ways share similarities in the way that we think about scale. So like tech companies, we think about scale in the way that loses that community intervention that I hope that I've shown you today, but also the tension around how we might enter those spaces. Right, so how we might enter these spaces really rely on a kind of like configuration of the two. And so in the kind of next few months, as we kind of build up a momentum around these maps, this is what we will be concentrating on. It's like how to bring these two into conversation and how we might perhaps experience how we might encounter solidarity through these lived experiences. So, I am going to bring it to a close because I really would like to hear your thoughts on the kind of questions that I have brought to the table today. And I don't know if you saw earlier, but I put in the chat the link of the events that we're holding next week, because we do have one on environment and data. We also have a panel on rights, access and refusal. So we have a lot going on next week. So I'm not trying to promote here, I'm really not, but I'm just kind of almost signaling that this is also a part of the process that we've been doing, is really trying to think about how the network visualizations and how we can reconfigure and like engage stakeholders, research, just like bring people to the table. I hate that saying, but I kind of like it as well, because I kind of like to turn it on its head. But yeah, so I love to hear questions and thoughts on what we've been doing.
Okay, thank you very much for this fascinating and insightful presentation. You touched on so many important and interesting issues. It's hard where to begin. I have there's so many questions popping up left and right. But let's go back a little. You said regarding the ethical prototype for networking. So it's about how to identify oneself, how to situate oneself within networks. And you also mentioned that this relates to more than this aspect. You mentioned specifically storytelling. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's actually interesting. Let me touch on that storytelling. Let me tell you about storytelling. We have a project within a project, and because I think this is a testament to the kind of work that we've been doing, we've actually have a sub-project called Almost Future AI, which we invited 3 fiction authors to work with researchers in the field. And so we set these fiction writers off into the Turing Institute, various organizations, and they interviewed these researchers and then wrote a kind of story in response. And it's really interesting because each of them, one of them wrote a story on Poppins. One of them wrote a kind of short piece about the Turing test. And in the Turing test, it's kind of like these bots are conversing with each other. And this is like another way of we are trying to imagine networks. Like we're trying to bring these people together in ways that you are creating these encounters, right? And so you create these encounters between the fiction writers and the researchers. But because of the current situation, we've not able to have in-person events. So we've been holding the salons online, which the researchers came to. So we ended up having these conversations about the text. So it became very, very reflective. And in doing so, we will be publishing in a few months a short story, but we actually wrapped around some of the conversations that are happening. So this in itself becomes another type of networking in the visualization of networking, because we have the conversations as footnotes to the stories, because there was a real reflection on what the stories meant to the researchers, or it kind of amplified. You know, we talked about AI assistants, but rather than focusing on the gendering of AI assistants, which we all know about, actually a lot of people were talking about listening as a practice, right? So what is the ethics of listening? And which was really interesting if you're thinking about Black Lives Matter and all these other movements, is what it means to be an active listener. And so that meant that the conversation shifted. And so these are these really nice moments where these encounters, if you like, generate and these other ways of being in these kind of network buildings. I know it's a little bit cheeky on this storytelling, but I felt like it was a good example for going from kind of AI assistant to really thinking about ethics of listening and that the implication of that, and how perhaps that might relate to some of the conversations you're having during this conference.
Yeah. Then as a follow-up question, so to zoom out, so to speak, and focus on the larger picture when it comes to thinking about the conversations and restructuring engagements. What would you emphasize here? You already said, well, this quickly brings you to the ethics of listening. What are other factors that are important to changing the landscape here?
That's really good question. It's kind of a difficult question to answer in many ways, because I'm in many ways I really wish that we had already completed the survey tool that we're going to launch next week, because I think that will generate a lot of insight, because I think the result, and I know it seems abstract to people that perhaps are here today, but I think that in itself is a real reflection on looking at the data that we have collected in the last year and making these kind of observations of kind of absent voices, but then trying to design a tool that really allowed other conversation to enter into the field of AI ethics. It's like, and I think these are moments of intervention that are really quite difficult, because you have to design something in a way that really allows for people to enter, and you have to kind of, and I think that's why we called it a reflective tool, because initially it was a survey tool. But yeah, I wish that I could use that as a way to answer your question, because I think that will be a really good indication of the work that we've been doing. And I should say that when people fill in this survey, describing their own position, that there will be a map, another network map, where you can see yourself in relation to others. So you can see your answers in relation to others. So I hope that in this map that we can see people working on sustainability, climate, access in ways that are not present right now.
Thank you very much. I have here another question that is somewhat different, but related to this topic, because I think you also mentioned it's important to relate that to the ground. And now we have this more abstract networks and situating oneself within them. But what about so to speak, the activism on the ground? You had this nice example of the wheelchair symbol that was painted over. And as far as I know, you yourself are an artist and activist. And so the question is, so does being an artist also influence your work and other parts of your activities? So given that we also, in the context of this conference, we have a connection to art. Tomorrow, at the end of the conference, there's the station trailer. So so there popped up the question: what place does have? What place does it have for you, and how do you see activism in this context?
I can relate this question perhaps to my own practice. I haven't spoken about it much today, but my work primarily kind of thinks about access work, and so access work in many ways is dealing with the abstraction of accessibility by large tech companies. So like how they might take up access as a way to promote employment for disabled people, but they are precarious forms of employment, which go unquestioned. And so a lot of the stuff that I have been doing is really thinking about how to engage with some of the kind of invisible labor of access itself. You know, thinking about captioning, for example, is a process that's been automated, which I've made a film in response to this and showing how actually it's an intimate form of labor that sonographers, when they're training to do this type of work, they have to build dictionaries that are very much related to the clients they're working with. And so I've made films showing the database, like the dictionary being built. And that is a way of really bringing those personal narratives to the foreground to kind of really move away from the idea that the captions just appear, you know, because the kind of paradox here, maybe this is that disability, the civil rights movement for disability, people with disabilities, is there has been a need to kind of think about independence. And by thinking about independence, they place the kind of invisible labor that's happening into the background. So this is a policy issue now. It's like, how do we bring that back into the foreground? And I think that, again, really shows some of the challenges of the project in thinking about the abstract nature of the network visualization to on-the-ground examples.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Since you mentioned access, so in this context, there is this is also I think one of your current projects, the automation of access. And so there is a tension in the automation of access process between scalability and fit, between standardization and customization. So can you relate this? Can you say a little bit more about this tension with respect to access?
Yeah, it's you know, one aspect of Just AI is that we have multiple working groups within the project. We have one on environment and data, and we have one on right access refusal. And in these working groups, we have been hosting events, and this is what I said earlier in the talk, is that Sarah Hendren was one of the speakers, and this is really a moment we grappled with scale, and will it scale? That kind of prevalent like conversation around standardization is that I think if we go back to captioning, for example, is that the idea that one can standardize access in a way that is, I don't know, tucked under the kind of banner of democracy is kind of dissolve the connections between local communities. You know, local communities that have a particular dialects or a particular way of producing knowledge that not necessarily meets with the idea of the standardization of access, right? So there's this continual dialogue between the two, like how do we make sense of what's happening on the ground, the local context? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question. This concerns your background of a, you held a position in the feminist labor lab. Here the question is, can you say something, so what are the challenges in the context of what you said from that perspective? Could you say a little bit more about that?
You know, it's really interesting because I'm still doing work for the Feminist Labour Lab, and Lily Arani is leading on a project where looking at taxi drivers in San Diego and how perhaps they can develop a platform that promotes fairer conditions for drivers, aside from Uber. There's a particular history in San Diego of taxi drivers being quite active in promoting their kind of right to have a medallion, which is very expensive. It is all aside for a moment, but working on that project is really interesting because my own involvement, I could identify the lack of access for people. There's only one vehicle in the whole of San Diego that's accessible. And this raised many questions around how to build, which has kind of folded in the rhetoric of thinking about sustainable vehicles and like how to bring that into conversation with access in ways that the conversation slightly shifted because it's become a conversation between sustainability and access. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, and I think it's a kind of testament to the kind of precarity that's going on too.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again for your exciting and fascinating talk.